All the world's in want, and is writing a letters from a person to a place about a thing. And all the world's on wish to be carrying a letters to a king about a treasure from a cat. When men want to write a letters, 10 men, ton men, pen men, pun men want to rise a ladder. And den men, dun men, fen men, fun men, hen men, hun men went to raise a leader. Is then any letters day from many peoples, Daganasanovich? Empire your outermost, a posy chord place. So is the state of the world as told by Finnegans Wake. And among the various meanings, which I've done a lecture on Sherry Benstock where she glosses this passage specifically, among the many things that we can tell about this passage is the centrality of writing, of letters, both as individual characters in an alphabetical system, and a letter as in sending a letter from some person to another. And therefore, all of the world is sending a letters. And I think the syntax of this is very important. A, instead of just saying is sending letters, it's a letter, but letters, it's multiple, plural. It is already plural in the singular. This is very similar to what John Cage says in his essay For the Birds that you can find in Hatred of Capitalism, where he says that he already sees plurality in the number 1, and that plurality is just an extreme form of repetition. That in every singular form, we already have a possibility for proliferation or dissemination, as Derrida would put it. In this lecture, I would like to examine the role of letters or litters, because there's a play on words that Joyce loves to do in Finnegans Wake, using Derridean theory, using terms like différance, play, dissemination, spacing, and seeing how these play into the polyvocal, polyglottal tonality, register, syntax, and function of Finnegans Wake. Throughout Finnegans Wake, we are told about the dissemination of a letter. But is it one letter or is it many? All of these little tabs on the side of my book indicate places where the letter is being discussed, and it's by no sense exhaustive, but just the ones that are most relevant for my study, because this is a topic of the Wake that I continue to come back to and find the most interesting. Because the letter serves as a synecdoche for the Wake as a whole. A synecdoche being a part which stands in for and functions as the whole does. It represents the scale of Finnegans Wake itself, the themes of Finnegans Wake, and a lot of the critical concerns of the Wake concerning mediation and delivery and form over substance. As, for example, Samuel Beckett has said concerning Finnegans Wake, here content is form, and form is content. The very manner of the content matter is tied up in the way that it is enveloped by the facts. And we're going to see some passages where he will play on some of the metaphorical language between an envelope, as literally something which surrounds something in general, and specifically something which encloses a letter within it. But Finnegans Wake tells us all the time that it is concerned with postcards and with relaying, saying, and may his 100,000 welcome stewed letters, relayed one post-chaste, multiply, I faith and plotiply, Sean himself. So not only is the character Sean constantly multiplying because he is the postman in charge of delivering the letter, which is written by Sean and told by ALP after it has been delivered by Sean, but we see that the letters are already multiple. There may in fact be more than one, and we have here almost a supplication that the letter should be multiplied, that it should go beyond itself. And indeed, Finnegans Wake is concerned with writing's ability to encode its own excess in such a way that it is not an object, properly speaking. This is the difference between book and text for Derrida. A book just seems to tell you facts, whereas a text is concerned with its enveloping facts itself. It is concerned with the manner in which it reveals and conceals. And the manner in which we are revealed the letter in Finnegans Wake is through traces, not through an originary presence, which is then modified through fragmentation, but rather the first instance we get is such that we are in medias res, or as Finnegans Wake puts it, in medias reads. In the reads in the midst of media, mediation, deferral as well. Finnegans Wake says, but resuming inquiries, will it ever be next morning the postal unionists, officially called carriers, Letterscotch Limited, strange fate, furious in de galaxy's height, de the lows that hucks around missive maids' gummy backs, to hand in a huge chain envelope, written in 7 diverse stages of ink, from blank chassons to lavendiette, every pothook and pan crook bespaking the washerwife, subscribed and sub-penciled by yours a laughable party, with afterwhite, SAG, to hide and cheek, Edenbury, Dublin, WC. Will whatever will be written in lappish language, with inbursts of Magyar, always seem samposed, black looking white, and white guarding black, in that Siamixed two-talk used twist stern swift and jolly roger? Will it bright upon us nidle, and we plunging to our plight? Will, it might now, miracle so it light, always and ever till Cox's wife, twice Miss Hahn, pokes her beak into the matter with Owen K after her, to see wha smutter after, will this Kiribis pouch, filled with litterish fragments, lurk dormant in the paunch of that halp brother of a ham, a poller box? So right from the very beginning, will it ever be next morning? So we're asking about the future, about whether or not the letter will be received. And not only will it be received, but will whatever will be written. Right? The writing is prospective. It may not have even happened yet. We may be concerned with the very conditions upon which the writing of a letter could begin in the first place. So not only is Finnegans Wake concerned with what is written, but what are the conditions of writing? What are the preconditions in the world that allow for us to write in such a manner? The deferral through all of these different systems. From Dublin, we have hide-and-cheek Edenbury, so this is HCE's initials, so it's concerning HCE, of course. And it's composed of litterish fragments that lurk dormant in the paunch, right? In the pouch in which it is delivered, and these lurk. So they don't just sit there, but they actively concern us in such a way that they lurk towards us mysteriously. They are concerning the Siamese twins, thus they are Siamixed tuatalk, right? And will it be brought to us in the night or in the day? Thus, will it bright upon us nidle? Will it give some brightness to our little night? Or will it plunge us into our plight? Or, because it concerns our plight, will it be inescapable that we will be plunged into something in the midst of trying to come out of ourselves by reading this letter? As such, Finnegans Wake stands behind the idea that letters are always outstanding and in the process of being written, never to be completed. There is no primordial unity that is the condition for letters, but in fact, it is the multiplicity already bred into unity, as Cage has mentioned, that is so critical to the ability of the letter to disseminate as fragments and to be found through its traces. One of the interesting things that Finnegans Wake therefore shifts away from is a talk of essences. And this is something that Deleuze theorizes about, that he wants to shift away from talking about the state or the human to a state, a human. Switch away from the definite to the indefinite article. Because when we're talking about the definite article, say the state, we're trying to reduce all states to an essential statehood, the stateness that makes a state a state. Whereas when we talk about a state, We recognize that every state that has ever existed is one among many, that it is historically contingent, and that there need not be something essential or unitary that pre-existed the arising of that single element in order for it to be as such. That unity does not pre-exist plurality, but the plurality of all is the condition upon which even a semblance of unity, of recognition, and of repetition can be achieved. Therefore, Finnegans Wake is not only concerned with substance, but with form, with the manner by which we are delivered our facts, and therefore it is concerned with discourse, the way that the envelope itself envelops, acts upon the facts. As Finnegans Wake puts it, luckily there is another cant to the question. Has any fellow of the dime-a-dozen type, it might with some profit some dull evening quietly be hinted, has any usual sort of ornery josser, flat-chested 40th, faintly flatulent, and given to rationization by syncopation in the elucidation of complications, of his greatest feng-yang dyna-descendant, only another the son of, in fact, ever looked sufficiently longly at a quite everyday-looking stamped addressed envelope? Admittedly, it is an outer husk. Its face, in all its featureful perfection of imperfection, is its fortune. It exhibits only the civil or military clothing of whatever passion-pallid nudity or plague-purple nakedness may happen to tuck itself under its flap. Yet to concentrate solely on the literal sense, or even the psychological content of any document to the sore neglect of the enveloping facts themselves, circumstantiating it is just as hurtful to sound sense. And let it be added, to the truest taste, as were some fellow in the act of perhaps getting an intro from another fellow, turning out to be a friend in need of his, say, to a lady of the latter's acquaintance, engaged in performing the elaborative ancestral ceremony of upstairs, straightway to run off and vision her plump and plain in her natural altogether, preferring to close his blankard's eyes to the ethequatal fact that she was, after all, wearing for the space of the time, being some definite articles of evolutionary clothing, inharmonious creations. A captious critic might describe them as, or not strictly necessary, or a trifle irritating here and there, but for all that's suddenly full of local color, and personal perfume, and suggestive too of so very much more and capable of being stretched, filled out, if need or wish were, of having their surprisingly like coincidental parts separated, don't they now, for better survey by the deft hand of an expert, don't you know? Who in his heart doubts either that the facts of feminine clothing are always all the time, or that the feminine fiction, stranger than the facts, is there also at the same time, only a little to the rear? Or that one may be separated from the other, or that both may then be contemplated simultaneously, or that each may be taken up and considered in turn apart from the other. So Joyce is raising a lot of critical concerns about the nature of letter writing. First, he's saying, have we ever actually stopped to think about the envelope over what's inside? Have we ever looked at these facts of feminine clothing, right? Clothing, which is always already erring, always drifting off, drifting from person to place and place to thing, always shifting between some of these because the letter has the stamp of personality, but it also has the marks of a thing, and it also is defined by the place that it's going to. So it's concerning all of these different noun cases. But also, it is dyna-descendans, right? It is descended from dynasties, but in the process of being descended, in the process of being disseminated down through a hierarchy, it dances, it shifts, or in Derrida's language, it plays. It has a fundamental tendency to err from any teleological path. As such, while envelopes act as a sort of clothing, they in fact are part of this game of the seduction of the object. As Derrida talks about it, we're often so concerned with subjectivity, we don't stop to think about the fact that maybe sometimes we invoke subjectivity to defend against the seduction of objectivity itself, of that object which resists being taken up and reduced to something subjective, which goes beyond a single interpretation and manifests its objectness as more than the whole we try to constrain it to, that it disseminates beyond. As such, this is why the feminine fiction is possibly stranger than the facts, but also the stranger facts may possibly be more fictional and more real still than the facts that lie within the clothiering, right? And we're imagining all of the things that could be inside, right? That it's a vision of her plump and plain and her natural altogether, that within here is a nude photograph of some kind. And yet, it represents, the letter does, the clothing around it, the definite articles of evolutionary clothing, which is to say contingency, right? And the question is, since a letter requires a recipient and a sender, right? It requires a self and another acting in a dialectic. Can we consider these apart from each other? Or are they equiprimordial facts, such that every sender is already his own receiver, already thinking his own audience, and its audience is already thinking of who the sender could be, filling in the gaps in our knowledge? But Joyce wants to leave these openings, show the spacing, as Derrida would call it, that is fundamental to writing. That writing is fundamentally constitutive of gaps which express their own agency, so to speak. They themselves act by spacing in between things and showing the gaps in our knowledge that we try to fill through the process of sending a letter which we must always defer. I really like the way writing, communication, and translation is thematized and problematized in the mute and jute dialogue. This is from the first chapter of the first book of Finnegans Wake, and it's always just perplexed me, but also made me laugh. Finnegans Wake is a very funny book, and this is one of the more funny passages, because they're trying to talk to each other, but they seem to always be talking past each other. Thus, they are emblematic of the sender and receiver who can't get on the same terms. They don't share the same conceptual scheme. This is something that Donald Davidson has talked about, and that I've done a lecture on before, that in order to interpret language, we have to have some sort of meta-language known as a conceptual scheme, which takes all the particular words that we see and formalizes them into a system where grammar can apply, right? A sort of logic. And also, there is an expected diction to be used in different circumstances. There are a number of discursive rules, in other words. Discourse and conceptual scheme are basically the same thing here for our terms. And the problem is, how do we know if someone shares our same conceptual scheme? And, well, we really can't. All we're doing when we're communicating is we're trying to ensure that the message stays as close to the same as possible, but we can't know how that person interprets it except how they react. Thus, communication is really about interpreting and reacting to effects. And this is a point of Derrida's too, that all we have in writing that gives us, for example, the illusion of the authentic presence of the author, like we're getting their real soul, is the effects from whatever words they put down. And that gives us the illusion of someone who's being honest versus insincere. We don't know their mind, we just know the effects of what they put down based on the standards of our conceptual scheme. And this is hard when we go on Finnegans Wake's level because it's talking about all of human history. Therefore, there have been a number of different conceptual schemes, and indeed a time when formalized conceptual schemes were not as easy to proliferate. We didn't have the institutions to do that. Thus, mute and jute are at a historical time where those institutions have yet to be, and thus we get mute saying this. Quite agreeim, Busavasek. Walk a dunblink roundward this Altuzel, and you will see how old you plain of my elders, Humphrey and ours, where wan to whale wimbrel to peewee or the saltings, where will by city, by law of Istman, where by droit of signory, ice flow was from his in the beginning to whose finish there punct. Let ere him romeromera merge two races, Swit and Brack. Mothering rue, Hither cracking eastwards, they are the surgeons. Hence, cool at ebb, they requiesce. Countlessness of live stories have nether fallen this plague. Flick as flowflakes, litters from aloft, like a vast wizard all of worlds. Now are all tombed to the moon, Isgus to Isgus, Erda from Erda, pride, O pride, thy prize. So this is such an interesting passage. First off, because of its poetic brilliance, in my opinion. I think it's so interesting that we have this very fragmentary sort of idiom at the beginning, and then we have a much more poetic, ending in this pride, oh pride, thy prize. This is almost a pseudo-biblical idiom that we've got going on here, where our prize is our pride, our ability to latch on to our individuality, right? And what we have here is letters or writing being conceived of as a series of historical traces. We get this in the beginning, right? This law of the father who institutes the beginning of a formal system, followed by a finish there, Punkt. So a period, right? Punkt is German for point. So we have a definite point where it stops, and yet the letter keeps going after that. After the Punkt, it keeps on going, showing that anytime we put a period, right, this is only relatively a stop. It's a stop in a larger series of goings and stoppings. Therefore, we are mirror merging two races, sweet and brack. Like sweat and black, so I'm thinking like blood, sweat, and tears that we've got going on here. And hence, cool at heb, so HCE, requiesces, right? He's trying to reclaim by acquiescing to historical standards of the expectations of writing. And yet, as we look back on history, we see that all of those past fathers that are hence cool at heb because they're dead are in fact tombed to the mound, tombed to the Mund as well, the mind in German. Isgus to Isgus, Erde from Erde, right? Earth to earth. We start at the earth and we end at the earth. So what we have here is formal cinders of the past, which are to be burnt asunder and already have been burnt asunder, to be resurrected anew through difference because anew. Because every time we come back to communicate, we are forming the past anew and we are in a dialogue with the past. One might imagine adding a signature to this litter, right? This litter from aloft, which would read, signs the multiple hands of history. Because history is always made by the multiple. It requires being reduced to some sort of formal scheme that we can make sense of, but it's always written by multiple hands, always thought by multiple minds, and always presumes multiple audience members, which are going to take different interpretations. This is why history is never final, why we always have to have new iterations of our notions of history. Here's another passage that I think you'll agree helps link the similarities and differences between writing letters and writing and language as a whole. Gaping gill, swift to made earthers, stern to check self, diagnosing through eustache tube that it was to make with the markedly post-puberal, hypertituary type of Heidelberg manlike cavern ethics. Lufted his sloping forward, bad sweatigor, good morra, and double notch onto it, as he was greedily obliged. And like a sensible ham, with infinite tact in the delicate situation, seen the touching nature of his perilous theme. Thanked him for guilders, received in time of day. Not a little token a bach all the same, that was the owl the god's clock it was. And upon humble duty to greet his tisk minister, and he shall gild the gap gaper in thee his mouldy voids, went about his business, whoever it was, saluting corpses, as a matter of course. One could hound him out, had one heart to, for the monticules of scalp, and dandruff droppings blaze his tail, accompanied by his trusty snorler, and his permanent reflection, verbigracious. I have met with you, bird, too late, or if not, too warm and early. And with Tog for Iliad repeated in his second mouth language, as many of the big-timers verbatim words which he could bobbily call to memory that same Kveldev, ere the hour of the twattering of birds, in the twitter litter between Derrida and the deep sleep sea, when suppertide and souvenir to charlatan mall jointly came gently. So here, language is itself an evasive letter, always already delivering, ever deferred. Hence, I have met with you, bird, too late, or too warm and early, too warm and early, right? It's as if we're already too late or we're never yet there. This is the nature of writing's incompletion and its dissemination into the future, right? Therefore, when he mentions Heidelberg man-leicht cavern ethics, right, we have man-easy ethics. So this is the illusion that writing is easy, some sort of ethical strategy to pick up the pieces. But Joyce wants to show that writing is also a way to create new pieces, right? Pieces of artwork. And by doing so, the letter is an ethical strategy of production, of recognition, plurality, and resurrection of the dead litter of language. Hence, we are indeed saluting corpses when we write and when we read, as a matter of course. Thus, to write a letter is really lettering, which is to say writing as an action, a motion with its own momentum, precedents, expectations, and habits of circulation. As Paul Virilio has said, all objects today are in a state of habitable circulation. In other words, a relative movement as a part of a system which is habitable, which makes sense and has its own expectations. And there is no such thing as stasis, for stasis is death. And as we read Finnegans Wake, we are reading a body. We are reading the stamps on the textual body as if they're tattoos, and tattoos that linger and slip. As he says, the letter, the litter, and the soother the bitter, of eyebrow penciled, by lips tipple penned, borrowing a word and begging the question, and stealing tinder and slipping like soap. Which I just love this passage, right? Because the letter is always slipping or playing as bodies slide past one another, as entire bodies of expectations change, suddenly or slowly, as bodies of text are split off from one another, segmented to different parts of the page. We're really playing with the embodied nature of language in Finnegans Wake. As such, Joyce wants to show writing as a convivial, social, communal practice in Finnegans Wake. He writes, I am a worker, a tombstone mason, anxious to please Averyburys, and jolly glad when Christmas comes as once a year. You are a poor Joyce, unctuous to police no bobbies, and Tonabelly Solly when 'tis time to go home again. We cannot say A to A. We cannot smile nose from nose. Still, one cannot help noticing that rather more than half of the lines run north-south in the Nams and Bucharest directions, while the others go west-east in search of Malitzes with Bulgarad for. Tiny for, though it looks, when stump-stilling along other incubala, it has its cardinal points for all that. These ruled barriers, along which the traced words runs, march, halt, walk, stumble at doubtful points, stumble up again in comparative safety, seem to have been drawn first of all in a pretty checker with lampblack and blackthorn. Such crossing is anti-Christian, of course, but the use of the homebound Shelley law as an aid to calligraphy shows a distant advance from savagery to barbarism. It is seriously believed by some that the intention may have been geodetic, or, in the view of the cannier, domestic economical. But by riding thitherways, end-to-end, and turning and end-to-end hitherways, riding and with lines of litters slittering up, and clouds of ladders slettering down, the odd semamte place, and droop it back again from them, let rise till home. Lit, sleep, where in the waste is the wisdom? So we're searching through all of these historical refuses, right? All of these traces which, as for Vico, and this is a reference to Vico, trace a path from savagery to barbarism, to civility. But with civility comes its own problems, its own new ways of transmitting information, and tracing. Therefore, we are seeing the institution of discursive rulings, right? These ruled barriers are matrices through which we can understand things. They are conceptual schemes that help articulate the multiplicity and plurality of the world. But they have their own blackthorn ulterior motives. They themselves are thorny and risk poking us and imposing their own damages. Right? They're like band-aids which cover over the gaps of the body. Try to convince us that the body is perfect when in fact it is always fleek as flowflakes, litters from aloft, right? And these litters slither. We can see that Joyce is playing with the orientation of the page itself here, right? Talking about whatever the use may be of discourse. Domestic, economical, whether it has something to do with a geodetic intention, whatever that may be. We're always writing thitherways end to end and then turning, always slithering, thithering various ways. I just love the way that he's playing with the tongue itself, just sort of slither around the mouth like a snake which is engaged in sin. And I think for Joyce, language itself is something of sinning. I'll put on the screen here an excerpt that I found in James Joyce's Alphabet Notebook, which seems to link writing to sin, but as a necessary sin which allows the plurality of the universe to speak forth. As such, I think that we really see a hearkening to all peoples, all times, and asking them to look at the enveloping facts of the tools they use, because language is a tool. And it is constrained within the toolbox of discourse. And Joyce wants to have a productive and evasive conversation between language and metalanguage, thereby denying the transcendence of the latter, of the metalanguage, and in so doing, giving us an immanent language of birth and change and femininity. That being said, that's it for this lecture. I hope it's been somewhat helpful in thinking about these ideas. You can check out any of my other lectures that I've done on postmodernism, German idealism, gender theory, post-colonial studies, and other classic literature. You can also become a channel member for $5 a month and gain access to, among other things, a private philosophy Zoom, which you can tailor to your needs. I also have super thanks if you'd just like to donate to the channel, because it helps me purchase the books necessary to bring y'all wonderful content. That being said, that's it for this lecture, and I will see you in another one.